Welcome to another one of our advocacy updates. I'm Austin Harris, the Director of Member Engagement here at KASB. As always, I'm joined by Mark Tallman, Leah Flatter, and Scott Rothschild from our wonderful advocacy team. And as always, they've had a busy week, but an especially action-packed and busy week this week as the legislature worked on a number of bills. So we've got a lot to get to today, a lot to process together. So we're going to dive right into it. Maybe the biggest news, or at least the news with the most potential impact, has been around school funding. We've got two bills working through both chambers at this point, Senate Bill 267 and House Bill 2119, that are dealing with school funding. The big news this week, team, was, of course, Senate passing their school finance bill. What can you tell us about what that package includes, what it means for schools, and where it goes from here?
Well, I can start. I'm sure my colleagues will want to add as we go forward. So one thing to understand is that the Senate has now passed its budget. Senate Bill 267 is basically the budget for the entire state, all state agencies, including K through 12 education. Now, keep in mind that what the House looks to be doing is passing a budget that has everything except education in a comparable bill, and the education funding in a separate bill with what they call policy pieces, the private school issues, remote learning limits, and some of those things. This week, the Senate passed a bill after turning down an amendment that affects school funding. The amendment would have restored what the governor recommended to fund the Gannon plan and fully fund school finance, not only this year, which is taken care of, but next year and the following year, which is 2022 and 2023. What the Ways and Means Committee did, which the Senate ultimately passed, is to remove all the increase in general state aid that is for the next 2 years that are the result of the increased base state aid, and taking out about $10 million more each year in higher local option budget state aid that, we have to put in more LOB state aid because the LOB typically goes up when the base goes up. Finally, they removed the money and the authorization for high density at-risk weighting, which is normally part of your general state aid because it's a weighting factor. That means over 2 years, they removed $570 million total from 2022 and 2023. The direction or the justification is to say they want to explore whether federal COVID money could be used to replace this or supplant this, and that they will revisit it at omnibus. Now, what that means for those of you new is this kind of means, well, we want to pass a budget now, but we usually save a lot of issues until the final session in May. And the idea is, well, we'll come back and see whether we can do that. And of course, the big concerns, I think, and we will list a couple very quickly with this approach. Number one, most people who've looked at this does not believe this would be legal because COVID money is, every version that has passed has indicated that it is for expenses specifically related to the pandemic, not just to backfill what you were already planning to do. So that's kind of point number one. Point number two, if you could do that, the bill as it stands now does not have any mechanism to actually get that money back in. In other words, they didn't say we're going to take out this state aid, but here's a provision which transfers an equal amount of money. They just said that's what we intend to do. Third or fourth or whatever I'm up to, districts are getting COVID aid based primarily on the Title I formula, which is not necessarily the same as how you would lose money if the base is reduced over these 2 years. So some districts, what you're getting in COVID aid, if you could spend it, might not cover what you would lose under this approach. Fourth, I think I'm up to, if this happens, this means districts would be using COVID money for what was expected to be the Gannon funding, which means there would be not as much left over, if anything is left over, for the additional expenses caused by the pandemic. getting back to school, addressing learning loss, summer school, extended time, social emotional support, mental health, all those things that the federal money would allow you to do, there'll be less of that available if you're replacing state aid. And maybe the final point to make under this plan is it also means that because all of this federal money is one-time money, it will eventually expire. And when that happens, the state will have to come up with the money down the road to replace what they've taken out now. We have posted on our website a link to information that was released by the State Department of Education. It's a spreadsheet that shows how much your district will lose under these reductions next year. I don't think it goes to the following year, and how much you have gotten under the second round of ESSER, which is about 300 and help me, Leah, $40 million.
Something like that.
And some win and some lose. Now, what legislators are going to tell you is that we've learned that the third round of ESSER is 830 million. That's going to be more, if that comes true, than the total loss the second year. But again, we don't know if that will be true on a district by district basis, and we don't know whether, you know, that and it will still then erode how much you have available to help with learning loss. Tried to make these points as the Senate voted. The vote was fairly close, but ultimately not successful. Many senators were saying, look, all we're doing is checking. Don't worry, we're all committed to having the money there. We're not going to cut your budget. We just want to see what flexibility we have. Maybe that's true, although again, it still, if we could do this, has negative consequences. Critically important to know how this would affect your district, share it with legislators. I'll quickly note that the House plan does not do this. The bill that the House committee is proposing fully funds the governor's plan with one exception. It doesn't provide the high density authority and funding, as I understand it at least. There wouldn't be the authority to spend it in 2023, because they continue to say we need to look at that law. Now, we can talk in a minute about the other policy pieces in the House bill and a few other things, but so right now, here's where we stand. The Senate has passed a bill that reduces that level of funding. The bill that is going to go to the House at this point does not cut that. There's a lot of talk about how the legislature wants to use federal COVID money, school money to help fund education if they can. I'm going to pause and let either Scott or Leah add anything, or to maybe see whether there are questions from the group, or Faustin, if you thought of anything. So Scott and Leah, what am I missing on the budget pieces at this point?
I don't think you're missing anything, Mark. I think we'll just be keeping an eye on, you know, part of the reason I think the House Appropriations Committee yesterday did not adopt what the Senate did is the House wants to have a different position than the Senate as they go into conference committee, you know, assuming that House Bill 2119 passes the House, which I'm not so sure that it will, but anyway, you know, that might be, I think that's their strategy right now is that, you know, the House will adopt a different position than the Senate, and they will try to come together on that. I agree with Mark. I'm not sure why they think they can use this federal money in the way that they think they can, but I guess we will find out.
Well, and I'll just add that, you know, this federal, many of our critics have been pointing out, and it looks like correctly, that there has been some loss of learning because a lot of kids haven't been in the classroom all the time. So we understand that, and the education community understands that. And this federal money is to help solve that problem. And it's going to take like a 2 or 3 year process at least. And that's the federal money is for 2 or 3 years, I think. And so you're going to hear a lot of proposals in the legislature to supplant general funds with this federal money. But that really represents a cut to us because this federal money is for a specific purpose to help students get back on track who have struggled during this pandemic. So, our critics, one side of their mouth, they are criticizing us for all the learning loss. And on the other side, they're saying, hey, let's use this federal money for other purposes. Well, that doesn't, jibe right. So this is a discussion that's going to be going on in the legislature for the next month, because there's a lot of federal money coming and legislators have a lot of ideas on how to use that money.
I think it's important to note also that while we're talking about, oh, we need to be supplanting these federal funds because we're in a pandemic and we have to be very careful with our money. On the other hand, the legislature has a couple of tax bills teed up. Senate Bill 22 has something like $500 million in income tax and other revenue cuts for the state. There's a similar House bill that only has about $120 million in foregone revenue that it would enact. So the legislature is talking about, making hundreds of millions of dollars of tax cuts, which, as you probably know, result in less money in the general fund. At the same time, they're talking about we don't think we can afford to fund schools or social services or anything else out of the general fund, and we need to use federal COVID funds instead. So I would say it's a very problematic scenario right now.
And to clarify, the cuts in funding in the Senate bill as it stands now don't just impact this fiscal year, but next fiscal year as well, correct?
Well, the COVID money is spread out over several years, as someone indicated. I think so that the ESSER 1 money was the first like 80 million we got. That's probably basically going to all be spent by the end of this year.
Right.
The second round, what's called ESSER 2, the 340, basically could be spent this year and next year. And the third round, we think, could basically be spent over a 3-year period. But here's the critical thing I think we have to talk to people about. You can't use one-time federal money for ongoing purposes. Whether it's a tax cut, because if we've got this money, so that frees the ability to raise taxes, that's a permanent loss in revenue. Or even, I mean, there was a lot of discussion in the legislature, in Senate Education Committee this week about, well, we're hearing from employees who say we still don't have enough people and you're still not paying enough and you're getting all this money. Number one, most people don't believe you could use this federal money just to give a raise or just to hire a new position, unless you could directly tie it back to COVID. But more to the point, you won't be able to sustain that after this money has gone away. And so that's a critical thing that we need to have this conversation about. There's a lot of discussion of, you're going to have this money for the next 2 years, so schools won't need as much money. Even if that's true, even if you accept we could, and even if you accept, we don't need the extra money that Scott's talking about, it's all going to expire. And what we haven't seen is a profile or plan that would talk about what's the legislature's path to then restoring that possible offsets if that would occur.
And just one more super nerdy in the weeds detail that I feel important to reiterate is that the newest federal bill also says that if you are going to start a voucher program or expand a voucher program, you have to give back a similar amount of the federal money that you're receiving. So if you're going to start a new voucher program, such as education savings accounts, which is what's envisioned in House Bill 2119, and let's just say that costs you, $10, you would have to give $10 of your federal COVID money back to the federal government, prohibited under the law. And again, as you also know, there is a proposal in 2119 to expand the tuition tax credits eligibility as well. I think you could attach maybe some projected fiscal note to that, even though the bill at this point does not raise the cap on the $10 million. So there are a number of things that were put in that federal bill to prohibit states from doing the very things that seem at this point anyway to be envisioned by our state legislature. So we're in a very sketchy time right now, and we really need you all to remain engaged on this.
Yeah, Leah, that's a great point. Another provision in the federal law is that states would have to maintain the same percentage of their budget going to K-12 education. I've had at least one conversation that suggests that we might fall under that if we're cutting $570 million out of spending. That's something to watch. And another super nerdy detail that you may also want to be aware of, for reasons I would love to explain if anyone asks, but what you just really need to know is the base cut that would be required under this is not just the increase in the base you're planning for next year. It would actually cut the base below where it is now. So again, I would strongly encourage you to look at those spreadsheets for your district and get a handle on what those costs could potentially be. And then Leah is absolutely right. You're going to have legislators, again saying, "Oh, this is a bad idea," and oh, don't worry. And if you're saying this is great, I think our message just needs to be, because there's a good chance this won't be done before May. We need to then make sure we're communicating what we're learning about why this can't be done or what the bad consequences would be for individual districts. And noting Kathy Waller getting an alert. Again, I hope you're all doing that. When we, that's the most important thing, is for people to hear from their constituents what they think and how it would affect their individual district. So thank you.
Yeah. So as we watch the Senate work their side of things, we've also got House Bill 2119. Leah and Mark, you both mentioned it. It does include the Gannon funding for this year, but there are also several policy points in it that KSB has opposed. What are those policy points? We've talked about them, but maybe briefly reintroduce them to the group. And then what are the possible paths to reconciliation between, at this point, what are two very different budget bills in the two chambers?
Well, the policy points, I'll start and then I'll let Mark and Scott chip in, is initially one of the first things they did was, try to expand the existing tuition tax credit scholarship program, which currently only applies to free lunch students in the lowest 100 performing elementary schools, gives them, the opportunity to get a scholarship to go to a private school. And the proposal is to expand that to free lunch and reduced lunch eligible students in all elementary schools or all schools in Kansas. Scott or Mark, you can back me up on that. And then the other provision is that in addition to this existing tuition tax credits program, the legislature is contemplating establishing a brand new separate program for education savings accounts. And that says that if a parent wanted to do so, they could establish an education savings account with the state treasurer, and that would be the student's base state aid. And they could take that money and use it for private school expenses, or I think some tutoring expenses as well. And I think once they sign up for that, that can go practically in perpetuity. It could be through high school graduation, I think. So that is state funding going directly to schools, to theoretically to private schools. That's much closer to a pure voucher. And I think there are going to be a lot of strings tied to that. And I would be very surprised if particularly some of the accredited religious schools even want to get involved in that. But again, that's kind of inside baseball, and I get a little worked up about this. But anyway, and then the another provision of the bill is to put some limitations on remote learning. And I think I might turn that over to Mark or Scott while I take a drink of water.
Well, the two key provisions on remote learning is, number one, it puts a hard cap on the amount of time a district could have kids in remote learning or hybrid learning. Any use of that, it has to be in an emergency like a pandemic. It has to be approved by the state board. And there's only, I think, 240 hours above that. Any time beyond that would not count toward your minimum school term. So there's one thing that sort of affects your calendar of how you would operate. The other piece is it would limit the time an individual student could be in remote learning. And our big concern, well, I shouldn't say wouldn't limit it. It would say that if an individual student is in a remote learning as defined in the bill, which is basically not in person for over 240 hours, I believe it's the same, then you have to count them as a virtual student, which basically means you get a flat amount but no weightings. And so in most cases, the district would get less funding. Now, the idea behind that in virtual is most virtual schools were started to serve kids who never intend to come into a bricks and mortar school. The theory was that they don't cost as much. What this does, though, is to say, even if you have students that say want to go in a hybrid model, want to go part-time because it's more flexible for their family or for education or for employment, or just a redesigned environment that says some kids, I can get more done studying at home without the distractions of being at school, but I still want, the services, or I will come to school some days, I want to be part of that. This would say in that environment, over that threshold, you as a district would lose funding on that student. And so those things, again, we both think, number one, kind of take away board authority and flexibility in an emergency. Now, again, hopefully we won't have another pandemic for another 100 years, and this will to some extent be a moot point. This has never been an issue before, but that individual student learning time, we think, really could work against some of the school redesign and flexibility ideas that we've been wanting to do. We would also note that that bill contains an extension of the 20 mil statewide levy, which does need to be done, and that's important. And then a little something for you to consider is it recommends, but does not require, that boards give every classroom teacher a $500 bonus out of the COVID money. Now, again, could it be used that way? Well, I don't know. I mean, if you could argue that they've really worked hard during COVID and they need some support, that would kind of be up to review by a KSDE panel, which is looking at it. So not binding, but it's, I think, something the committee wanted to do to say, we support our staff, we support our teachers, and you could kind of get caught up in whether or not you want to do it. Could be a whole other issue as the potential negotiation issues around this particular type of compensation, but be thinking of that. So those are kind of the key pieces that is in the House plan. Again, that's on general orders and can be taken up at any time, except Monday, because it hasn't been announced to be taken up Monday. And we didn't say this at the beginning, but for some of us, we're counting down. There are now basically 3 weeks from today is the end of the regular session. So next week will be the last week most committees will meet to work bills and have hearings and send them out. The following week will be several days of floor action to work those bills, and then a week or so of conference committees. However, budget bills, school finance bills that we're talking about here, they're all exempt from those deadlines. So they can really happen at any time and certainly could be carried over into the final session, which, to kind of get back to Austin's point, I'm not sure we see a clear path yet on how they'll get together. But I do think legislators certainly know they've got to pass something. They'll want to pass something. I think it's going to be a question of what type of other strings may be attached, which is what the House wants to do, or how they want to look at different ways to use funding, which is what the Senate is exploring.
Scott, anything to add to House Bill 2119?
Well, no, I think Mark and Leah covered it really well, and Mark's last statement about, it looks like it's setting up to be a conference committee where the House side has the funding we want, but all the policies we don't want. And the Senate is silent on a lot of those policies, but has this kind of amorphous, weird idea about using federal funding, which we don't want. So we're kind of caught between a rock and a hard place on both those bills.
And really, regardless of what the path forward is for both bills, the critical point for those watching today and those engaged in local leadership is to continue to communicate with your legislators as they walk through this process. The narratives in the legislature we've talked about a lot. We hear all the time that schools are too cash rich, that they don't need the money, that they're not using the money the right way. And the only way to push back against that narrative is to push back against that narrative and speak to legislators and leaders. So Mark, Leah, Scott, with kind of 3 weeks left in the regular session, any advice or push you have to folks to continue the work they've been doing all session, advice to give, encouragement to offer?
Well, I will just say we know people are being heard, and that's good. I will tell you that there are some legislators that are frustrated with what they're hearing from some people in some quarters. I'm a big believer that you have to modulate your message and understand your audience. And It's generally important to be respectful, but to be very clear in your position and the impact. And so I'm going to say the same thing I say over and over again. Know how these bills affect your district, know how they could affect your students, and communicate that. Tell the own consequences of what these mean to your district, your community, and in particular, your students. So just to go back to Scott's point, if we're limited on the extra money we can provide to recover learning loss, it's going to be harder for us to help the very students that we're most concerned about and kind of suffered the most. Those are the messages we have to get out. But I just say kind of keep it up. I think we are having an impact. And in particular, when we know what hasn't been resolved in the next couple of weeks, that'll give you time to work with people locally during the break before they come back in May.
Okay. Well, that could have been enough for this week in of itself, but of course, in the Kansas legislature, that's never the whole story. Several other bills were worked and moved around this week, including one that popped up, House Bill 2397, around some remedial reimbursement. Team, what can you tell us about the theory behind this bill, kind of the interactions between Regent schools and K-12 schools? So what's the idea behind it and where's it sitting?
Well, again, I've kind of monitored that, but I know the other folks have too and may want to jump in. So 2397 is the House budget bill. It's the companion to 267, except it doesn't have education, but it does have higher education funding. And there was a long debate yesterday about an amendment proposed by Representative Sean Tarwater that would have, it was again fairly conceptual, and it may be more important to worry about the concept. He wanted to essentially require school districts to reimburse post-secondary education for the cost of remedial courses. The theory is if school districts are graduating students that go on to college and can't do college work, and the districts and the universities and there are even the students can't do college work and have to pay for remedial courses, the state shouldn't have to pay for it. The taxpayer shouldn't have to pay for it. It ought to be paid by the school districts who didn't do their job. That's kind of the narrative. So this was defeated. So why are we talking about it? Because I think it is something we could see again, and it may be important to know a couple of facts. And again, real quickly, I want to state the discussion was high school graduates should be college ready. So I'm going to suggest there is a state law which spells out a college prep curriculum that is not the same as what is required to graduate from high school. In Kansas, we have long had a difference between the idea that what it takes to graduate from high school prepares you for college level work. And because students are not required to take that curriculum, many students don't. And so it's probably not shocking that if you haven't had math, English, or science to prepare you for college work, that you're not ready. So maybe it's a policy discussion we ought to have as to whether that should be required. Right now it isn't, because the higher education institutions have qualified admissions. Most students have taken that, and only about 10% of those students take remedial or what they call developmental courses. About 35% of community college and technical college kids have to take those courses. Again, not terribly shocking because those institutions only require a high school diploma. So if someone says, well, I don't want to go to college, and then after their senior year or after a year out decide, maybe I should, those tend to be the students. Nonetheless, this has been a long-standing argument that schools are failing because people need remedial courses. I would just note one thing I found. It's amazing what you can find on the internet, a report from the Regents which showed that the percent of 17 to 19-year-olds taking remedial courses, the percent and the numbers have actually been dropping for the last 4 or 5 years. So, I guess that undercuts a little bit the argument that we're not making any progress, but there are those that would still say, well, that's way too many kids and it's way too much money. So I guess in this area, this is one where, number one, it's important to know the issue and know, I think, real honestly, what is your district doing to prepare kids? But a big part of the discussion has to be, should we expect and set a curriculum that prepares every student for the rigors of college level study when we know that many students are probably not interested or may not be attending to go and might be more likely to drop out? Or on the other hand, if it's that important, should we do it? I don't know, but I think there's an explanation about where we are right now. Finally, in honor of Dr. Heim, if he's still on, I would point out another complicating factor. He's waving, that he always likes to remind me, and I think I confirmed this, is there are different standards across post-secondary education as to what they say requires remedial work. So there isn't a single standard to say this child has passed this class, so they ought to be ready. Those may vary, and that complicates it as well. So that's the speech I prepared over and over in my head yesterday as this debate was going on. But I know some of my other colleagues were tweeting and reacting as well. See if they want to add anything.
As someone who escaped college by taking business math, I think you covered it very well.
Laura Bors is noting, some people are good at figures, and some people are not, I guess, and are better with words. So as a proud English major, yeah, that's kind of an issue to be at as well.
Yeah.
Some of the committee members really did try to make that a little more clear. They either had experience as a school board member, or they had personal experience with their own kids or their kids' friends that, maybe the friend, is not a native English speaker or whatever, that just saying that it's K-12's fault if a kid doesn't hit a certain test metric. They were trying to communicate that doesn't mean that their K-12 schools aren't doing their job. But anyway, I think Mark has covered it very well.
Yeah, we'll continue to watch that and see if it rears its head again as the legislature moves towards the close of the session. There was some good news this week. Team's been tracking Senate Bill 235 closely. That's the all people back in school at this date bill that we've been talking about for weeks now. Team, you can update the group, but that failed in the House this week when it came up for vote. So what update do you have for the group on 235?
Well, in this Easter season, it died, but has been to some extent reborn very quickly, but with kind of different impact. Most of the concern I think that KASB had about Senate Bill 235 was not really the get kids back now, because overwhelmingly we heard from districts that they were doing so. And I think Leah's going to talk in a minute about some further news from the CDC. But our concern was it basically said you had to offer an in-person learning option by this date this year and then forever after. And our point was, forever is a long time. There's a lot of other things that could happen. And so shortly after this bill was defeated, the K-12 Education Budget Committee amended a Senate Bill 63, took out the contents of that and instead said you are to have kids back by March 31st, but it only applies to this year. So a lot of the concerns that we had about the possible future implications and other complications that were never very clearly spelled out might still be problematic, but they're unlikely to arise by the end of this school year. So at this point, it seems to be fairly symbolic and not terribly dangerous in the form it is right now. And it is scheduled for general orders debate on Monday at 11 o'clock.
And Leah, as Mark teased, we did get some updated guidelines from the CDC today on social distancing in schools. So what update do you have to share for the group, and how might that impact getting students back into schools?
The CDC said today, and I haven't read all of it because it just came out not too long before we, as we were preparing for this this show, but they seem to be saying that you can have kids social distance 3 feet apart rather than 6 feet apart if the students are wearing masks. That's my top line overview of that. So I think you're going to want to be checking up on that, because obviously that impacts, the number of classrooms you might need are still social distance, depending on what your local rates are. So please check that out. I'm sure you'll be looking at through your professional networks, and we'll be doing some more analysis as well.
Very good. School budget process and the 20 mil levy were also talked about today or this week in the legislature. Senate Assessment and Taxation Committee held a hearing on Senate Bill 277, and a couple of other bills tied to this are moving their way through the legislature. So what update do you have for us on those two pieces?
Well, again, I've followed some of this, so I will start. The 20 mil levy under the Supreme Court of Kansas has ruled that even though school districts collect it, it is a statewide levy and by constitution can only be adopted for 2-year periods, which means every 2 years it has to be extended. Normally that's not too controversial. This year it's gotten kind of tied up in 2 issues. One is a week or so ago, we told you that the Senate had agreed to House changes to make school districts come under the requirements of Senate Bill 13. This is a bill which says in order to adopt a budget that raises property tax revenue above a revenue neutral rate, you have to go through some extra steps to notify taxpayers and hold a separate hearing. Now, once you do that, you are not limited in how much you can raise. It's not a tax lid, but you have to go through that process. Or if you don't, you have to return the excess money that you raised. There were really 2 concerns. One is whether it made sense to include school districts because our budgets work so differently. We're already capped. We're controlled by things like equalization, the 20 mils is set by the state, et cetera, et cetera. Well, we're probably going to lose that battle. But there's also the question of the timeline of when districts would be notified of what their revenue neutral rate was, how that works with getting information from the State Department of Education on what your budget should be. So some expert superintendents have been trying to work with the committee. We're trying to come up with some modifications that if school districts can't be removed, which was the Senate's original position from those notice requirements, that at least maybe the deadlines would be changed. We don't know if we would be successful. We would just ask you and your business folks to be aware of the bill, look at the timelines, maybe be in communication with your county officials on how this might work. I think most people agree that if we absolutely have to, it can be done, but it is very, very tight timelines that could be difficult on some of the things that are set out in this. So that is expected to be worked next week. Also complicating it is that normally non-controversial 20 mil levy. Well, now some legislators have decided this would be a great place to do some tax cuts. And so one proposal would be to phase that from 20 down to 19 next year and 18 the next year, which costs about $50 million, I think, when fully done. Another proposal from Governor Laura Kelly's tax committee is to increase the $20,000 residential exemption for the 20 mils from $20,000 to $40,000, which also costs around $50 million. So now a fairly simple bill that was kind of complicated by concerns over Senate Bill 16 has now been brought into the tax cut discussion, which Leah has already alluded to. So we now have discussions of cutting the statewide mill levy to cut property tax. We have discussions of cutting corporate income tax to be more economically competitive, discussions of cutting individual rates to take advantage of federal reductions, of cutting the food sales tax because that's regressive. So just about every tax policy is now kind of in play, and it's highly unlikely any of them are going to raise much money by the time we're done.
Leah, Scott, anything to add? No. Well, we'll move on to the Kansas Emergency Management Act. We've been watching that develop in both the Senate and the House. They've been in conference committee, and seems like they've got an agreement moving forward. So what's the update on the Kansas Emergency Management Act, particularly as we've been watching how it might impact schools in those emergencies?
I hate so much to do all the talking, but as I quickly summarized it, I'll try to hit this, and we'll try to make it brief. There is an agreement. The legislature adopted a conference committee report on Senate Bill 40. It's going to the governor. It passed pretty overwhelming and pretty bipartisan, which indicates there's a good chance it will be signed. B, it lays out a lot of things schools have to do in the COVID-19 pandemic, but the way the bill finally passed, it only applies to the COVID-19 panic for schools. And so I guess we would suggest you probably don't need to worry much about it right now, unless we have, because the authorization for this emergency management declaration, I believe, expires the end of this month. And so we would be happy to take your questions, but fundamentally, it looks like most of the changes for schools were linked to this particular pandemic and would not necessarily apply in the future. The end.
That was short and sweet. I mean, the Mark Tallman way.
Well,
that was courtesy really of the House, that was the House position. And I just have to give a little credit to former KSB President Fred Patton and to Representative Brad Ralph. They were the kind of the movers and the shakers on the House position on that. So if you see them or are their constituent, give credit where credit is due.
Yeah. Leah, you've been watching closely House Bill 2089 dealing with firearms and gun safety trainings in schools, and you've got an update for us on that this week.
Yes, the House passed that bill this week. It is a bill that says that while school districts do not have to provide gun safety training in K-12 classrooms, if they do so, they must comply with guidelines established by the State Board of Education. And the bill tells the State Board of Education that in developing those guidelines, it must rely on the gun safety training offered by the NRA, which is called the Eddie Eagle program. So they can use Eddie Eagle in K through 5 and in 6 through 8. But then also in 6 through 8 and in the high school grades, the curriculum could also involve the hunter safety training that's offered by the Kansas Department of Wildlife, Parks. Again, schools are not required to offer the training, but if they are, they have to comply with guidelines that are based on the NRA in the early grades and then NRA or Wildlife and Parks in high school.
Scott, you've been watching and following Senate Bill 208, which is one of the more controversial bills that we've seen in the legislature this session. The Senate approved that this week, and of course, it's dealing with transgender athletes and their participation in sports. So what update do you have for the group on that?
okay, thank you, Austin. The Senate passed, as Austin said, Senate Bill 208. This would prohibit transgender females from participating in girls or women's sports. It applies to K through 12 and post-secondary. So before hitting the floor of the Senate, the bill was amended in committee to remove a provision that dealt with how to resolve disputes regarding a student's sex. Under the original bill, these disputes could have been resolved through verification by a healthcare provider as part of a physical examination. A lot of people found that very distasteful. So that was taken out of the bill. So, but the bill still says K through 12 schools and post-secondary institutions shall have boys, men's, and girls, women, and co-ed teams designations, and that athletic teams for females shall not be open to students of the male sex. And basically, when that provision was taken out in committee, it kind of leaves the entire administration of this bill, if it does become law, which I don't know, it leaves it to the Kansas State High School Activities Association. KSHA has a policy for transgender student participation that says schools using school registration records and medical documentation are responsible in determining the appropriate gender team for participation by students. And once a student is identified as transgender, they will participate in that gender category in all sports, and that KSHA also resolves disputes. So a lot of critics of the bill say at this point, what is the point of the bill? Because KSHA already has this. So the bill passed the Senate, and now it goes to the House. I don't believe it has been assigned a committee yet. So we'll just see how this develops from here.
Might just add one thing about activity association. I don't know if this is addressed at all, but this bill also applies to college level athletes.
Right.
Okay, thanks for the update, Scott. Leah, we'll jump back to you. You've been watching House Bill 2039 dealing with the civics test for graduation. That's now on the Senate side. Senate Education looks to be holding a hearing on Monday. So what update do you have for us on that?
We will be testifying against that bill in Senate Education on Monday. It has been amended somewhat, but it still requires students to take and pass a civics test based on the naturalization test sometime between grade 7 and 12 in order to qualify to receive their Kansas high school graduation diploma, in order to graduate from high school. So it was tweaked just a little bit to make that test free. It just, it gives you a link to go to take the test, rather than, there was some concern that it would take about $400,000 to purchase the test. So they cleared that up, but it still requires students to take and pass that test before they can graduate from high school. And as I would imagine everybody on this Zoom knows, Kansas students are already required to take 3 units of government before they graduate, and that includes curriculum on the United States government. It includes, knowledge of the Constitution. And really, as we all also know, the State Board of Ed and our schools are really trying to transition away from just saying, oh, seat time is what you need to learn about civics, but rather to participate in your community and to be active in your community around issues like, helping register people to vote, working at the polls on election days, going and monitoring a local school board meeting and writing a paper on it, those types of things, rather than just, checking the box that you've passed a test. So we continue to oppose this bill on those grounds. And, not to mention it does trespass on the State Board of Education's constitutional authority. So we will oppose that on Monday in the Senate Education Committee.
In the category of student health and support, there's kind of a trio of bills that KSB has supported, continuing to get work, and that includes Senate Bill 62, House Bill 2086, Senate Bill 51. It's more than a trio. Senate Bill 120, House Bill 2115. So a few more than 3, but maybe 5 or 6 bills that KSB has supported in student health. What updates do you have for the group on those bills?
Well, Senate Bill 62
go ahead, Leah.
Go ahead. Senate Bill 62 was about school vision screening tests. We supported that. And House Bill 2086, which is emergency medications in schools, allowing schools to maintain some extra, say, EpiPens or asthma inhalers. We understand there may be an amendment offered to kind of insert some of the House Bill 2086 language into Senate Bill 62, but also I think change it a little bit. So I'm not yet what our position is going to be on that. We're consulting with some of the other stakeholders about that sort of combo bill. We support vision screening and we support emergency medication, but we're not clear on how that amendment might affect the amended bill. So we'll be monitoring that bill. The foster care report card, Mark has been working on that one, so I'll throw it back to him for Senate Bill 51.
Yeah, I was just trying to get in so I could use the word quintet. The foster care report card would just put in state law, Governor Kelly's executive order to monitor foster care education results, which are not good, in Scott's immortal words, but it provides a baseline to improve from. Has not been controversial, has not been amended. So that's one that is having a hearing this week. We'll be testifying in favor of. And then just very quickly, although Leah has been following them, since I have the floor, there are 2 bills which deal with creating an oversight committee for child welfare. Very, very similar, making their way slowly through both houses. And they don't appear very controversial, but that issue has not been fully resolved.
Joining the orchestra in the category of post-secondary education and workforce preparation is a quartet of bills, including Senate Bill 32, House Bill 2287, House Bill 2442, and House Bill 2351. What instruments are they playing, and where do those stand in the process?
Well, Senate Bill 32, and I've already exhausted my knowledge of music, is a well-respected bill that would allow districts at their discretion to pay all or a portion of the post-secondary fees for students in concurrent or dual enrollment courses, which could be particularly important in our COVID recovery period and helping kids get back on track for post-secondary education. That had a hearing this week. It has not been worked. House Bill 2287 creates a new scholarship program for kind of technical and two-year degrees. Passed the House this week, has a hearing in the Senate. We are supporting that. And then a kind of nagging issue of concern is around high school work-based learning programs and liability, which we support the concept, but have had concerns that bills in the past, in attempting to solve some problems, may create others. A brand new bill has been introduced with the same subject, House Bill 2442, which we've just learned has a hearing Monday. And so don't really know the fate on that. It is the chair, Chairman Tarwater, is a big fan of that bill. We believe he's continuing to work that bill. We will try to be in contact to be helpful if we can, but we've been somewhat limited because, frankly, just the limitations of liability coverage available has been a problem. But we certainly want to find a solution if we can.
I would be remiss if I let us leave today without at least touching on House Bill 2238, which had a hearing in a Senate committee to be held on Tuesday. Leah, you've been tracking 2238. Any update on that one in particular?
It's a bill that would remove the existing $500,000 cap on donations that a school board or a city government may receive from a patron in order to set up or furnish a library. I guess that limit was enacted back in the 60s when $500,000, bought a lot more than it does today. And so this bill just removes that cap and allows school districts and city commissions to work together if they receive a bequest to set up and or furnish a library. It was really prompted by, there was one town that received a bequest. The town did not have a library. So this was a very welcome donation that they received from an estate, and they were getting ready to put everything in place, and they found out that the donation exceeded this 60s era cap. And so it's really focused on one city, but it benefits probably a lot of communities across the state, and we support that.
And as we move to wrap up, Mark, we've been watching House Bill 2411, which deals with some of the professional negotiation agreements. What do we know about that bill, and where is it in its process?
Well, that bill would allow the local Board of Education to choose which teachers association it wanted to bargain with, regardless of how many members or regardless of what percent of your teachers were in favor of which group. Before you get too excited, we oppose that bill on the grounds that 2015 KASB, USA, school superintendents, and KNEA sat down and worked on probably the biggest changes in the Professional Negotiations Act since it was passed, to kind of come up with something we all felt we could live with. And our delegate assembly adopted a position saying we support that law as amended in 2015. So we basically did not get into the merits of you to pick who you want to bargain with, but simply said, we reached an agreement. We've not heard from our members that they want to see that changed, and we're sticking with that. It was the proponent basically said that he was introducing it because he has heard frustration in this year of COVID from teachers who feel that their views were not being represented by their association in most cases, but not all. That's a KNEA unit, and school board members who were frustrated. And I said, that may well be, but our position is, based on what our delegate assembly has told us. The committee is not scheduled to meet again to work this bill, but there's certainly a reasonable chance they could. So it is a bill that we are opposing. Has not come out of committee, but it is still a possible bill.
As we move to wrap up, team, any final thoughts you want to share as the legislature heads into the next week?
I think we've already shared most of them. I'm sorry if we seem a little bit tired. It seems like a long week, and we're expecting another 1 or 2 or 3 in that vein. But as always, thanks for your help and support. We'll welcome any questions and whatever you can do to keep working with your local legislators, and tell your friends. And for people who are not able to watch this live, we certainly hope it's helpful. So let people know that it will be available for them to enjoy over their weekend if they have the chance. Probably a really great, if you've got an hour before the basketball tournament starts, this would probably be something that many people would enjoy as kind of a warm up to a day of watching the basketball tournament.
This is better than any pregame programming that TNT or ESPN is going to put on for college basketball. So I think Mark's onto something. You know, we tried to bill ourselves as pregame to the Super Bowl. That maybe didn't work out quite as well as we would have liked. So take that advice from Mr. Tallman how you will as you head into a little bit of March Madness. As always, we appreciate you. Oh, Dr. Heim, I knew you'd want to speak to that.
Well, I just want to point out that as exciting as Mr. Tallman's reports are, I'm guessing that his own wife is watching basketball right now and not watching the Facebook Live.
Well,
I was
watching
gonna add,
basketball
as a K-State
doesn't
fan.
keep her. I'm sorry, Dr. Jordan.
No, I was just going to say, as a K-State fan, this is my only highlight for the weekend right here. So I preemptively took it, Dr. Heim, because I knew you'd say something about that.
Yeah, I would just say that my wife does not need basketball to not watch me doing these shows.
Well, regardless of how you choose to spend your weekend, whether deep in advocacy sessions with us or watching that little thing called March Madness, we appreciate you giving us an hour of your Friday afternoon to talk about the legislature. The next 3 weeks will be busy. We'll continue to be pushing information out to you. We appreciate all the work you do representing your districts, your students, your educators in the state. Continue to do that. Continue to speak to legislators. Continue to celebrate the good work that all of you are doing, and we'll continue to work with you to get those messages out and about. We'll be back next Friday, same place, same time, same corny jokes, and we hope to see you there.